Let me tell you a story about finding yourself when it feels like you're lost in life's relentless blizzard. A story set amidst the magic of winter in New York City. Sit back, relax, and let this tale gently guide you into peace. The streets of New York were covered in snow. Flurries swirled through the air, blanketing the city in white. The winter wind whispered through the tall buildings, creating a soft hum in the background. It was a busy evening, with yellow taxis honking and lights blinking from every direction. But for Kofi, it felt like he was a world away from home. Kofi had flown in from Lagos, Nigeria, just a few days ago. In Lagos, the streets were lively, filled with music, chatter, and the warm glow of the sun. Here in New York, everything felt cold, both the weather and the people rushing past him. He pulled his thick coat tighter, grateful he had listened to his assistant's advice to dress warmly. Kofi was a wealthy businessman back home. He had built his fortune in technology and loved the life he had created. But tonight, in this foreign city, Kofi felt small and unsure. His plane had landed that morning, and his schedule was packed with meetings. He wanted to impress the American investors and show them his company's potential. But now, as he walked through the snowy streets, Kofi had to admit, New York City was overwhelming. The buildings were taller than anything he'd ever seen. The sidewalks were crowded, and the air felt sharp and icy on his skin. It was almost 7 p.m. when Kofi decided to walk back to his hotel. His meeting had run late, and he wanted to clear his mind. The soft snow under his boots made a crunching sound as he walked. He checked his phone to follow the map, but the battery had died earlier. "No problem," he whispered to himself. "I remember the way." But the truth was, Kofi didn't remember the way. The streets all looked the same to him. Rows of buildings with glowing signs and endless streams of people. He turned a corner, thinking it led back to his hotel, but instead, he found himself in a quieter, darker street. The snow was falling harder now, and fewer people were walking past him. He glanced around, his heart beginning to race. He reached for his phone again, forgetting it was dead. "Excuse me," he asked a man passing by, but the man walked past without looking at him. "Hello?" Kofi tried again, but no one stopped. Kofi shivered and looked up at the street signs. He couldn't recognize them. In Lagos, he would have asked someone for help, and they would have smiled and pointed him in the right direction. But here, people seemed too busy, too hurried to care. "I just need to find my hotel," he muttered, pulling his coat closer. The cold was biting now, making his fingers and toes numb. He walked faster, hoping the next street would look familiar. The city grew quieter as Kofi wandered further. The tall buildings gave way to older, smaller ones. The lights from the shops were dimmer, and the streets were uneven. His polished leather shoes slipped on the icy sidewalk, and he nearly fell. "Stay calm, Kofi," he told himself, but his voice sounded uncertain. He stopped for a moment to catch his breath, looking up at the sky. The snow fell thick and fast, and the air smelled like damp stone and frost. He thought about his warm hotel room and sighed deeply. Kofi continued walking, his breath forming little clouds in the icy air. A few people passed by, but they didn't stop to help. Some glanced at him with curiosity, probably noticing his fine clothes and lost expression. After turning another corner, he reached a narrow street that seemed completely empty. For the first time, he felt real fear. What if he couldn't find his way back? He thought of his assistant waiting for his call and the investors expecting him tomorrow. This was not how things were supposed to go. "Excuse me," Kofi called out, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet street. A figure appeared at the end of the road, walking toward him. As the figure approached, Kofi saw that it was a woman. She wore a long, tattered coat and carried a bag slung over her shoulder. Her curly hair peeked out from under a knitted hat, and her cheeks were red from the cold. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. Kofi hesitated. He wasn't used to admitting he needed help, but now, with the cold creeping into his bones and no one else in sight, He nodded. Yes, I'm looking for my hotel, but my phone is dead, and I don't know the way. The woman gave him a kind smile. Let me guess, you're not from here? No, Kofi admitted. I'm from Nigeria, Lagos. The woman tilted her head thoughtfully. Lagos, I've read about it. Big city, lots of energy. New York must feel very different. It does, Kofi said, his voice heavy with frustration. Everything is fast and cold here. She laughed softly. It's not all bad. You just have to know where to look. Kofi studied her face, noticing how calm she seemed despite the harsh weather. Do you know the way to the Metro Plaza Hotel? The woman nodded. I think so. It's about 10 blocks from here. I'll take you. Kofi blinked, surprised by her offer. You'll take me? Why would you do that? Her smile widened. Because you look like you need help, and I'm used to helping people. As they walked together, Kofi couldn't help but glance at the woman. Her coat was worn, her boots scuffed, and her bag looked like it had been patched many times. She didn't seem to mind the cold or the snow sticking to her hat. What's your name? Kofi asked. Ruth, she said simply. And you? Kofi, he replied. Thank you for this, Ruth. I don't know what I would have done. Gotten more lost, probably, she said with a teasing smile. But it's okay. I've been lost plenty of times myself. They walked in silence for a moment, the snow crunching under their feet. The city seemed quieter now, as if the world had paused for them. Kofi thought about Lagos, the warm streets, the familiar smells of jollof rice cooking, and the sound of people chatting outside their homes. New York is so different, he said aloud, more to himself than to Ruth. It is, she agreed, but it has its beauty too. You'll see. The snow continued to fall as Ruth led Kofi through the winding streets. Her steps were steady, even though the icy pavement was slick. Kofi stayed close behind, his leather shoes slipping occasionally on the uneven ground. He felt embarrassed, not just because he was lost, but because he was depending on someone he didn't know in a city that felt so unfamiliar. Do you live around here? Kofi asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. Ruth glanced at him and smiled. Kind of. I move around a lot. Kofi frowned, unsure what she meant. What do you mean, move around? She shrugged. I don't really have a place of my own. I sleep where I can, sometimes shelters, sometimes other spots. Her words hit him like a gust of cold wind. He had assumed she lived nearby, like everyone else he had seen on the streets of New York. But now he realized Ruth's situation was very different. You mean, you're homeless? He asked carefully. Ruth nodded, her expression calm. Yeah, been that way for a while now. Kofi didn't know what to say. Back in Lagos, his life was full of comfort, large rooms, warm meals, and people always ready to assist him. The idea of not having a home was hard for him to imagine. I'm sorry, he said finally, unsure if those were the right words. Ruth looked over her shoulder, her smile soft. It's okay. You don't have to be sorry. It's just life. They walked in silence for a moment. Kofi thought about his big house in Lagos and the staff who kept it running. He thought about the warmth of his bed and the meals he never had to worry about. And here was Ruth, walking calmly through the snow, even though she didn't have a place to call her own. What do you do? Kofi asked, breaking the silence. I mean, what did you do before this? Ruth adjusted the strap of her bag and sighed. I'm an artist. I paint. Or at least I used to. You don't paint anymore? Kofi asked, surprised. I do, sometimes, Ruth said. But it's hard to find space to work. Supplies aren't cheap either. Kofi nodded slowly, imagining her with a brush in hand, creating something beautiful. What kind of paintings do you make? Landscapes, mostly, Ruth said with a small smile. I like to paint places I wish I could go. Wide fields, quiet forests, peaceful rivers. That sounds nice, Kofi said, picturing the paintings in his mind. I would like to see them someday. Ruth chuckled. I don't have much to show right now. Most of my work is gone. Sold, lost, or left behind. Kofi glanced at her, noticing the faraway look in her eyes. She didn't seem sad, but there was a quiet longing in her voice. He wondered how someone so kind and talented could end up in such a tough situation. They stopped at a street corner, waiting for the light to change. Ruth pulled her coat tighter, her breath visible in the icy air. Kofi hesitated for a moment before speaking. Do you have gloves? He asked. Ruth shook her head. Number. But I'm used to it. Kofi frowned. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pair of leather gloves. Here, he said, holding them out. Take these. Ruth looked at him surprised. I can't take your gloves. You'll need them. I'll be fine, Kofi insisted, pushing them toward her. Please, take them. She hesitated, then smiled and took the gloves. Thank you, she said, sliding them on. They're so warm. Kofi nodded, feeling a little better. It's the least I can do. As they continued walking, Ruth pointed out different landmarks in the city. She showed him an old bookstore with frosted windows, a bakery with a line of people waiting for warm pastries, and a park where snow covered the benches and pathways. You see that? She said, pointing to the park. That's one of my favorite places. In the spring, it's full of flowers. Kofi smiled. I would like to see that. In Lagos, we don't get snow like this. It's always warm. Ruth laughed softly. I think I'd like that. Warmth all the time. It has its beauty, Kofi said. But this snow, it's special too. It's peaceful. Ruth nodded, her eyes following the snowflakes as they fell. Yeah, it is. Sometimes I sit in the park and just watch the snow. It makes the world feel quiet for a while. Kofi felt a strange sense of calm as she spoke. Her words were simple, but they carried a depth that made him think. He had been rushing through the city all day, focused on meetings and deadlines. But now, with Ruth, he felt himself slowing down, noticing the small, quiet moments he had overlooked. After walking for several more blocks, Ruth stopped suddenly. We're getting close, she said, pointing down the street. Your hotel is just a couple of blocks that way. Kofi followed her gaze and nodded. Thank you, Ruth. I don't know what I would have done without you. She smiled. It's no problem. I'm glad I could help. But as Kofi looked at the warm lights of the hotel in the distance, he felt a pang of hesitation. He didn't want to leave just yet. There was something about Ruth, her calmness, her kindness, that made him want to stay and learn more. Ruth, he said, his voice hesitant. Do you want to have a cup of tea with me, just to warm up before you go? Ruth blinked, clearly surprised. Tea? At your hotel? Yes, Kofi said quickly. It's the least I can do after all your help. Please. Ruth hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but just one cup. The warm air of the hotel lobby greeted them as they stepped inside. The contrast from the icy streets was instant, and Kofi noticed Ruth relax slightly, though she still held herself cautiously. She glanced around at the polished floors, the tall windows, and the soft glow of chandeliers overhead. This is nice, Ruth said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the quiet hum of people talking in the distance. Kofi smiled. It's a little warmer than the streets, at least. Ruth chuckled, rubbing her gloved hands together. A little. He led her to a quiet corner where a small seating area offered plush chairs and low tables. They sat down, and within minutes, a server approached. Kofi ordered 2 cups of tea, adding a plate of warm biscuits without asking if she wanted them. He had noticed the way her eyes lingered on the menu. Ruth seemed out of place in the grand setting, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. She slid the gloves Kofi had given her off carefully, folding them on her lap. Thank you again for these, she said, gesturing to the gloves. I haven't had gloves in years. They're wonderful. You're welcome, Kofi replied. It's nothing, really. It's something to me, Ruth said, her voice firm but kind. Kindness is never nothing. The tea arrived, steam curling into the air as Kofi poured for both of them. He handed Ruth her cup, and she wrapped her hands around it, savoring the warmth. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet hum of the lobby around them. "So," Ruth said, breaking the stillness, "what brings you to New York? Business, I guess." "Yes," Kofi replied, setting his cup down. "I run a technology company in Lagos. I came here to meet with investors." "That sounds important," Ruth said, though there was no envy in her tone. "What kind of technology?" "Software," Kofi explained. "We create programs that help small businesses manage their finances and grow. It's something I'm passionate about, helping people build their dreams." Ruth tilted her head thoughtfully. "That's interesting. You're building dreams, and I'm painting mine." Kofi chuckled softly. "It seems we're not so different after all." Ruth smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Maybe. But your dreams come with investors and big meetings. Mine are just colors on a canvas. Does that make them any less important?" Kofi asked gently. Ruth paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "No, I suppose it doesn't. Art has always been my way of holding on to hope, even when things feel impossible." Kofi leaned forward, curious. "What gave you that hope, even when things were hard?" Ruth's gaze grew distant, as if she were looking back into a memory. "When I was younger, I loved to draw. My mom always encouraged me, even when we didn't have much. She used to say, 'No matter where you are, you can paint your way to somewhere better.'" "She sounds like a wise woman," Kofi said softly. "She was," Ruth replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "But life isn't always kind, is it? When she passed, things got harder. I tried to keep going, studied art, worked odd jobs, but eventually, it all fell apart. I couldn't afford rent, and the rest, well, here I am." Kofi's chest tightened as he listened. Her story was so different from his own, yet he could feel the weight of her struggles. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it deeply. Ruth shook her head. "Don't be. I'm still here. And as long as I can hold a brush, there's hope." Kofi reached for the plate of biscuits and slid it toward her. "Please have one." Ruth hesitated, then took a small biscuit, holding it carefully as though it were fragile. She bit into it slowly, her expression softening. "These are good," she said with a small smile. Kofi smiled back. "The best food always tastes better when you're sharing it." Ruth nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "You know, Kofi, for someone who runs a big company, you're surprisingly kind." "I wasn't always," Kofi admitted. "I used to think success was all that mattered, but the more I achieved, the lonelier it felt." Ruth studied him carefully, her eyes full of understanding. "And what changed?" "Moments like this," Kofi said simply. "Meeting people like you." As they finished their tea, Kofi noticed the bag Ruth had been carrying. It was old and patched, but it looked heavy. "What's in your bag?" he asked. Ruth hesitated, then smiled. "It's nothing special, just my paints and a sketchbook." "May I see?" Kofi asked gently. She looked uncertain, but eventually nodded, pulling out the sketchbook. She handed it to him, and Kofi carefully flipped through the pages. Each drawing was more beautiful than the last. Sketches of cityscapes, flowers, and quiet places that seemed to tell a story of hope and longing. "These are incredible," Kofi said, his voice full of awe. "You have a gift, Ruth." Ruth blushed slightly, looking away. "Thank you. It's just something I do to keep going." Kofi looked at her, a thought forming in his mind. "Have you ever shown these to anyone? Galleries, maybe?" Ruth shook her head. "No one's interested in art from someone like me." "They should be," Kofi said firmly. "You have a talent that deserves to be seen." The warmth of the tea and the conversation settled over them like a soft blanket. For the first time that evening, Kofi felt completely at ease. Ruth's calm presence, and her honest words had a way of making the world feel simpler, even in a bustling city like New York. "I think," Kofi said slowly, "that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the hardest places." Ruth looked at him, her expression softening. "Maybe you're right, and maybe those places teach us what really matters." The snow outside had stopped, leaving the city blanketed in a soft white glow. Through the tall windows of the hotel lobby, Kofi could see the streetlights reflecting off the snow, casting everything in a calm, magical light. Inside, the warmth of the room was like a cocoon, making the world outside feel distant. Ruth sat quietly across from him, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. She seemed lost in thought, and Kofi hesitated before speaking, not wanting to disturb the moment. "You said earlier that art gives you hope," Kofi said softly. "But what do you hope for?" Ruth looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "I hope for small things. A warm place to sleep, enough food to get through the day, and maybe one day, a chance to paint in a real studio." Kofi nodded slowly. "It's not much to ask for." "For someone like me, it feels like a lot," Ruth replied with a wry smile. "But I've learned to be thankful for what I have. Even when it's not much." Kofi leaned back in his chair, her words echoing in his mind. He thought about his life in Lagos, the sprawling home with high ceilings, the staff who attended to his every need, the luxury of never worrying about where his next meal would come from. And here was Ruth, sitting across from him, grateful for a single warm room or a quiet corner to sketch. "Do you ever think about going back to school?" Kofi asked gently. "To study art again?" Ruth chuckled softly. "Sometimes, but it's hard to focus on dreams when you're just trying to survive." Her honesty hit Kofi deeply. He had worked hard to build his company, but he had never faced the kind of struggle Ruth described. His challenges were about ambition, not survival. "Back home," Kofi began, "people look up to me because of what I've built. But hearing your story, it makes me wonder if I've been focusing on the wrong things." Ruth tilted her head, studying him. "You've achieved a lot, Kofi. That's something to be proud of." "Yes, but at what cost?" Kofi asked. "I've spent so much time chasing success that I forgot what it means to simply live, to enjoy the small moments." Ruth smiled softly. "Maybe that's why you ended up lost tonight, to find those moments." They sat in silence for a while, the quiet hum of the hotel filling the space between them. Kofi felt an unfamiliar sense of calm, as though the rush of the day had melted away. "Can I ask you something?" Ruth said, breaking the stillness. "Of course," Kofi replied. "Why did you stop to talk to me?" she asked, her voice curious but not accusatory. "Most people don't." Kofi thought for a moment. "I think it was the way you looked at me, like you weren't afraid to see me as I am. Not as a businessman or a stranger, but just a person." Ruth nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "That's the thing about living on the streets. You stop seeing people for what they have and start seeing them for who they are." Kofi felt a wave of humility wash over him. "I think that's something I need to learn." Ruth glanced at her watch and sighed. "It's getting late. I should probably go." Kofi frowned. He didn't want the evening to end, but he also didn't want to impose. "Where will you go?" "I have a spot near the park," Ruth said casually, as though it were the most normal thing in the world. "It's quiet, and I know the people around there." Kofi hesitated, then stood. "Before you go, can I show you something?" Ruth looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Kofi motioned for her to follow him. "Just trust me." He led her through the hotel to a small gallery near the lobby. The walls were lined with paintings, each one lit softly by overhead lights. Landscapes, portraits, and abstract pieces filled the space, each more striking than the last. "Do you see this?" Kofi asked, gesturing to a vibrant painting of a city skyline. Someone created this, and now it's here for the world to see. Your work could be here too." Ruth stared at the painting, her eyes wide. "I don't know, Kofi. This feels so far away from my world." "But it doesn't have to be," Kofi said firmly. "You have talent, Ruth, more than most. You just need someone to believe in you." Ruth looked at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and doubt. "Why do you care so much?" Kofi smiled. "Because meeting you reminded me of something I had forgotten, that life isn't just about what we achieve. It's about the connections we make and the beauty we share." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her eyes drifting back to the painting. "I don't know if I'm ready for that, but thank you, Kofi, for believing in me." Kofi nodded, sensing her hesitation, but not wanting to push her. "Whenever you're ready, let me know. I'll help in any way I can." They returned to the lobby, the warmth of the hotel a stark contrast to the frosty air outside. Ruth picked up her bag, slinging it over her shoulder. "You're a good man, Kofi," she said softly. "Thank you for tonight." "And thank you for helping me when I was lost," Kofi replied. "I won't forget it." Ruth smiled, her eyes warm. "Take care of yourself, okay?" "You too," Kofi said, watching as she walked out into the snowy night. He stood by the window, watching her figure disappear into the distance. The city felt quieter now, as though the snow had blanketed it in stillness. Kofi felt a strange mix of sadness and hope, knowing he had met someone who had changed the way he saw the world. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the hotel, casting soft, golden patterns on the floor. Kofi sat at the small table in his suite, sipping his coffee. He had barely slept, his thoughts drifting back to Ruth and their quiet conversation. Her words lingered in his mind, challenging him to rethink everything he had built his life upon. Outside, the streets of New York were alive again, bustling with people navigating the snow-covered sidewalks. The city had its own rhythm, its own way of moving forward, and Kofi found himself wanting to be part of it in a way he never had before. Kofi picked up the small sketchbook Ruth had left behind the night before. She must have forgotten it in the gallery when they were looking at the paintings. He flipped through the pages once more, marveling at her work. Each drawing told a story, a window into a world of quiet beauty and hope. He knew he couldn't just let Ruth's talent go unnoticed. He picked up the phone and called his assistant back in Lagos. "Can you help me find a gallery in New York that supports local artists?" he asked. His assistant sounded surprised. "Of course, sir. What's this about?" "It's for someone who deserves a chance," Kofi said simply. Kofi spent the next few hours calling galleries, researching opportunities for emerging artists. He shared photos of Ruth's sketches with one gallery owner who responded with enthusiasm. "These are beautiful," the owner said. "We'd love to feature her work. Can you bring her by?" Kofi's heart lifted at the response, but there was one problem. He didn't know where to find Ruth. He had no way of contacting her, and the city was vast. Still, he refused to give up. He thought back to the places Ruth had mentioned, the park where she liked to sit and watch the snow, the spot near the bakery where she often walked. With a sense of determination, Kofi grabbed his coat and headed out into the streets. The city was busy as always, but Kofi moved with purpose, scanning every face, every corner. He checked the park first, walking through the snow-covered paths. Children played on the frozen ground, and couples strolled arm in arm. But Ruth was nowhere to be seen. Next, he tried the bakery. The smell of warm bread wafted through the air, and a small line of people waited outside. Kofi asked the shop owner if they had seen Ruth, describing her as best he could. "Oh, you mean the artist?" the owner said with a nod. "She's usually around here in the afternoons. Try the next block over." Kofi thanked them and hurried to the next street. His breath formed small clouds in the frosty air, and his shoes crunched against the snow. Finally, as he turned the corner, he saw her. Ruth was sitting on a bench near a small cluster of trees, her bag beside her and a pencil in her hand. She was sketching something in a notebook, her focus so intense that she didn't notice him at first. "Ruth," Kofi called out, his voice warm. She looked up, surprised to see him. "Kofi, what are you doing here?" "I was looking for you," he said, walking up to her. "You left your sketchbook last night." Ruth smiled sheepishly. "I did, didn't I? Thank you for bringing it back." "There's more," Kofi said, sitting down beside her. "I showed your work to a gallery this morning. They want to feature your art." Ruth stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "A gallery? Kofi, are you serious?" "Very serious," Kofi replied. "You deserve this, Ruth. People need to see your work." For a moment, Ruth didn't say anything. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the sketchbook, her emotions clearly overwhelming her. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Kofi said with a gentle smile. "Say you'll let me help." Ruth nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes, thank you, Kofi. I don't know how I can ever repay you." "You already have," Kofi said softly. "You reminded me what truly matters." Over the next few weeks, Kofi and Ruth worked together to prepare her sketches for the gallery. Kofi funded the material she needed: canvases, paints, and a proper workspace. Ruth spent hours painting, pouring her heart into every piece. When the gallery opening finally came, Ruth stood nervously beside Kofi, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. But as people began to gather, admiring her work and asking her questions, her confidence grew. By the end of the night, Ruth was smiling brightly, her joy infectious. "This is your moment," Kofi said as they watched the crowd. "You've earned it." Ruth looked up at him, her gratitude shining through. "I couldn't have done this without you, Kofi. And I wouldn't have found my way, literally and figuratively, without you," he replied with a laugh. Kofi returned to Lagos a week later, but he and Ruth stayed in touch. Her success in New York inspired Kofi to start a foundation supporting emerging artists and creative talents, offering them opportunities to grow. Ruth became a part of the foundation, mentoring others who shared her passion. Their chance meeting on that snowy New York night became a turning point for both of them. Kofi learned that true wealth lies in human connection, and Ruth discovered the strength to chase her dreams. Sometimes, life leads us to unexpected places and people who change us forever. Kofi and Ruth's story reminds us of the power of kindness, the beauty of second chances, and the importance of seeing humanity in everyone. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of hope and connection. Thank you for listening, and may your own journey be filled with moments of wonder and light. Good night.